everyone, welcome. I'm going to talk about iOS security today. The title is Everything Has Changed in iOS 14, but Jailbreak is eternal. My name is Fan Zuozhi, a security researcher from Ant Security, Tianqiong Lab. I mainly focus on macOS, iOS security. I attended Black Hat Asia 2021 as a speaker. I'm glad I could attend Black Hat again. On February 10th, Modern Toner released Securita Versa. It is the first workable iOS 14 kernel exploit, opened a door to iOS 14 jailbreak. After that, I published a stable kernel read-write primitive firstly, based on the exploit. Today, I will complete Project TQ pre-jailbreak, show how to run unauthorized code on iOS 14. This talk is about my iOS 14 learning journey. First, let's compare the security between iOS 14 and iOS 13. In iOS 13, there are many vulnerabilities in its life cycle. For example, OOB timestamp in iOS 13.3, tacking on in iOS 13.5, and OOB events in iOS 13.7. So a jailbreak is almost always available on iOS 13. But things changed in iOS 14. Since the first version of iOS 14, we got the first kernel exploit after more than 5 months. This is really a long period of time. Now iOS 15 beta is testing. Maybe iOS 14 will come to the end of its life cycle. There is still only one public workable kernel exploit, so iOS 14 is really a tough version. Why is iOS 14 so hard to be pwned? Well, iOS 14 introduced lots of new mitigations, such as the kernel heap hardening, data pack, user space pack hardening, TLP0 hardening, IPC key message hardening, and etc. Some works on the vulnerability stage, some works on the exploit stage, make iOS more secure than before. First, I want to talk about kernel heap isolation. With key heap isolation, you can't overlap the freed object with a different object. Avoid type confusion. That's a good way to stop UEF vulnerabilities. It's not new, but has been hardened massively in iOS 14. In iOS 14, key unlock heap is split into 4 subtypes. Now, allocations made by kernel extension are moved to key heap kext. Kernel objects and kext objects can't see each other. There is a heap named data buffers. Let's see the definition of it. This set of zones should contain pure banks of bytes with no pointers or offsets. So UEF in this heap has few harmful side effects. That's not a serious problem, and there is a special heap to store temporary data. When writing kernel exploit, we often use OS data to build fake or UEF object, but now OS data and OS string contents are moved into data heap. It is nearly impossible to build a fake object with OS data. What's more, Apple has moved more and more key objects into dedicated zones. Now, the heap in iOS 14 is fine-grained with few common areas, which significantly reduces the living space of UEF vulnerabilities. Data pack is newly introduced in iOS 14. You can mark a pointer using macro ptr or signed ptr. Then the compiler will add extra instructions automatically to protect this pointer. The disassembly code is shown below, one for storing packed pointer and one for fetching. The signing strategy is encrypting the pointer with a unique discriminator plus its memory address. So you can't touch any base of the packed pointer. And since the memory address is also involved in the encryption, you can't use the packed pointer in other memory address. Different from code pack, data pack is used for data integrity, ensure that the data is not modified by others. Now, most of the data pointers that AMPL considers critical, which are commonly used in exploit, are protected by pack, such as ucred, IPC port. Furthermore, data pointer is not the only scenario where pack can be applied. Sorry, my bad, complained about a WebKit commit ago. I'm not familiar with the WebKit exploit. I guess field M offset of struct assembler label is an important employed primitive. In this commit, AMPL expand M offset to 64 bits, so it can be signed by pack using the extra 32 bits. And what's more, with the GA case, you can sign arbitrary blob. Kernel exports an API to do this. The thread state in kernel is also protected by GA case. In iOS 14, you can find data pack in kernel here and there, but it's not easy to get rid of them. In iOS 13, all the user space processes share a same AK, so attackers can forge AK protected function pointers in other processes. This is a serious flaw. Then in iOS 14, AMPL decides to change this situation. Now, IAK becomes process dependent. Different processes use different IAKs. I named it user space pack hardening. This is detailed in kernel document pack.md. This change is effective to resist cross-process attack. But jailbreak also need to control other process, i.e. AMFID. This mitigation brings trouble. Fortunately, with kernel read-write, it is possible to bypass it. I will talk about this later. In the past, hackers used the task for PID 0 trick to access the kernel task port. It is the most convenient way to achieve kernel read-write. Almost every kernel exploit tries to build a TLP0, but that is not the case now. AMPL has hardened the kernel task. You can't resolve the kernel task now, and if you try to access the kernel map, you will trigger a panic. Both pre-A12 and A12 Plus devices are the same. We must find alternatives to TLP0 to achieve kernel read-write. There, I want to talk about a special kernel object, IPC key message. It is an exploit-friendly object. You can frequently see it in heap spree, but I must say key message is more powerful than that. With key message, you can directly convert a 2-byte heap overflow, which happens in key unlock large area, to a full exploit. The key idea is modifying field IKM size to free more memory, and you can look itself with a link pointer. But key message was hardened in iOS 14.2. All key message objects went to zone now. Data part is separated from key message header and moved into key heap data. So now you can't overflow a key message now. I think this is AMPL's smart idea. Without the essential exploit primitives, you cannot exploit a bug easily. This really matters to me. I had an iOS kernel bug, but the exploit code relies on key message. Without a key message, I'm not able to exploit now, so it only works on iOS 14.1. I can't find an alternative to key message yet. Alright, though it's very hard to pwn iOS 14, it is not impossible. Now, let's talk about the first public iOS 14 kernel exploit, CVE 2021-1782. It is a race condition bug in module IPC Watcher. We can convert the bug to a useful UEF. It was fixed in iOS 14.4 on January 26, 2021. After 2 weeks, Synactive published a blog post detailing how this vulnerability works. They also released a workable POC to demonstrate the vulnerability on iOS 14 by making the kernel crash. And then, in the same day, Modern Pwned published an exploit named Secuta Versa for this vulnerability. In the exploit code, kernel read-write primitives are included. That's amazing. Be aware that writing an iOS 14 exploit is not that easy due to the new mitigations. I really admire the techniques Modern Pwned shown in their code. Today, I will focus on how to execute unauthorized binary on an iPhone by utilizing Modern Pwned's exploit, and how to solve the problems I met, which was newly introduced by iOS 14. Okay, now let's see the kernel read-write primitives provided by Secuta Versa. It converts the original race condition bug to an UEF of packet options. There is a pointer in packet options, pointed to a packet info structure. You can overwrite this pointer by freeing and reallocating this object in user space. Then, through get and set socket option, you can read and write the packet info structure by the user space controlled pointer. That's the arbitrary kernel read-write primitives provided by Secuta Versa. We noticed that Secuta Versa utilizes socket operation to lay out the kernel heap. But in the past, we usually use OS data or key message to operate the kernel heap. So using socket is a little weird. That is due to kernel heap isolation. Now they are in different heaps. In this vulnerability, we must look up suitable objects in key heap default. The bad thing is the socket option object is nearly the only solution. Actually, there is a limitation on the kernel read-write. Every time we perform a kernel read or write operation, we need to free the old object, then reallocate a new object to modify the read-write address. But if we are not lucky, there is a chance that the memory hole is occupied by others. Then we lost control of read-write address. Kernel will panic, so this way is not very stable. When I debugged the code of Secuta Versa, I noticed that the write20 primitive failed sometimes. I don't know why. Then I checked the implementation of write20. It is based on set packet info. The code is in IP6 output. The data we write to kernel is actually a packet info structure. The first 16 bytes is an IP address. The last 4 bytes is an interface index. But there is a check about the interface index. It must be less than an RF indexed value. The value is the net interface count the system has. I don't know what the exact value it is, but it must be a small integer, likely 1, 2, or 3. So it's now clear that the 20 bytes we passed into kernel must end with a small integer, and I think 0 is the best value. Then we know that write20 is not an arbitrary write. There is a limitation. We can only write 16-byte arbitrary data plus 4-byte zeros. Of course, we can still use this write kernel data, but it will smash the kernel object sometimes, leading to kernel panic. Though there is limitations, the write20 is still very useful. It gives us a very good starting point. We must build new and stable kernel read-write primitives using read20 and write20 we already have. Before we had TLP0, it is the most perfect way to achieve kernel read-write. But now, due to the TLP0 hardening, it is nearly impossible to access kernel tasks from user space. We had to find an alternative to TLP0. We really need a kernel read-write ability in post-exploit stage. But how? The key idea is that we can find out a kernel object that can be accessed from user space easily and has specific interaction with the user space, like transferring data to and from kernel. Then we can use the write20 to overwrite the object, control the read-write address, transform it to a new kernel read-write primitive. But the question is, which kernel object is the suitable one? Well, I have read a paper, Exploiting I/O Surface Zero, by chance. The author is Chen Liang. Inspired by this paper, it seems that the key object I/O surface is a good candidate. If you are familiar with iOS kernel exploits, you must be familiar with I/O surface. Researchers often use I/O surface to do kernel heap spree, leak kernel memory info, or forge kernel objects. That relies on the flexible get-set-value external methods of I/O surface. In addition to this, I/O surface has lots of other external methods. As we expected, we can really build a new kernel read-write primitives on top of these external methods. Before discussing that, let's take a quick look at how I/O surface works. In user space, we use APIs exported by I/O surface DY-lib to interact with I/O surface, and use surface ID to specify which I/O surface we want to operate. But in kernel, it is a bit complicated. This figure tries to show how the I/O surface looks like in kernel memory. The surface root user client uses surface ID as an index to find the correct I/O surface. But kernel don't operate I/O surface directly. It uses an I/O surface client as an agent. Every request from user sends to surface client first, then will be redirected to I/O surface object. Actually, these are not important. I just want to explain that if we can control any above structures in this chain, we can directly influence the behavior of I/O surface operations. Now, let's see some special surface external methods. The first one is the set-indexed timestamp. This is some pseudocode from IDE Pro. Through this method, we can write a timestamp to the address specified by a field in the I/O surface object. This field is stored at offset of hex 360. So if we can control field 360 of I/O surface, we get an 8-byte write. Of course, we can use the write20 primitives to overwrite this field to obtain a new kernel write primitive. And what's more, in the core chain, we do not touch any other class field, so there is no side effect with the extra 4-byte zeros write. But actually, I didn't try this way. I will talk about it later. And there is another surface external method, get YCBCR matrix. We can use this method to read the field B4 of I/O surface from kernel. This time, if we can control surface pointer, we get a 4-byte read, and there is no side effect too. Now, With the two external methods exported by I/O surface, we obtain both new write and new read primitive. But we can't build these new primitives based on an unstable write20. All the new ones will be unstable too. We must use another way to modify the class field or kernel memory. To modify kernel memory, I think the most convenient way is the shared memory. This time I choose pipe. Though pipe is not a real shared memory, it works like a real shared memory. When you write data into pipe, the data will be cached into a block of kernel memory named pipe buffer, as if you write something to kernel directly. So if I can move I/O surface related objects into pipe buffer, I could modify them freely. Actually, it is easy to achieve this. After all, we already have a write20 primitive. Just overwrite surface client array pointer in root user client. Force it pointing to memory in pipe buffer. Then you can forge surface objects as you want. And now you can read-write arbitrary kernel memory using a fake surface pointer and a fake field 360. Besides pipe, there is other better ways to create a shared memory with kernel, but I'm lazy. I just simply reuse the code learning from Brandon Azer's Watcher Swamp. The implementation of new kernel read-write primitive is simple. Using read20 to find out the memory address of pipe buffer, then assign the address to surface client's array using read20. After that, we can specify read-write address by a pipe write. Then call the get and set external methods of I/O surface to achieve arbitrary kernel read-write. This is stable and will never panic the kernel. Now we have a good alternative to TFP0, and we could share the primitive with other processes with a daemon. Since we already have the ability to do kernel read-write, it's time to do something useful. That is the jailbreak thing. My goal is simple. I just want to execute arbitrary unauthorized binary. It is somehow equivalent to take full control of my iPhone. That's enough. It is better to stand on the shoulders of giants to do something. So I just port the code of freeze sandbox to Secuta Versa. Next, I will discuss the troubles I met in the porting progress and how to solve them. To execute a binary, we need the fork EXEC syscall combination, but it is disallowed by sandbox. So the first thing is to disable sandbox. It can be done by nullifying the process sandbox slot in MacLabel. But starting from iOS 14, here is a pack mark on the pointer. As we said earlier, we can't touch any bit of a pack protected pointer. So can we modify the sandbox slot to a null pointer? The answer is yes. Actually, there is a flaw in data pack. Let's see the disassembly code of function MacLabel get. There is a CBZ instruction. If it's a null pointer, the function just return null. The packed pointer will not be verified at all if the pointer is null. For performance considerations, null pointers are handled specially in pack. We usually use memory set 0 to initialize an object. Adding pack to every null pointer will bring loss of overhead. So, in most cases, we can nullify a data pointer safely. Now we are out of sandbox, but AMFI will stop us to execute unsigned code. We have two choices: inject CD hash to trust catch, or bypass AMFID check, but injecting hashes into trust cache needs kernel code execution. It is somewhat difficult. AMFID is an user space daemon. It is easier to take control of an user space process than kernel code execution. So I will try to force AMFID to be happy as the free sandbox does. Suppose we want to run a signed but unauthorized binary named a.out. A request will be sent to AMFID. AMFID daemon realizes this is not a legal program, then will stop it running. Now that we have kernel rewrite, we can try to turn our own process into a privileged process. Get the task port of AMFID and set exception port for it. That is a debugger for AMFID. Then we are able to control the behavior of AMFID. After that, we can intercept the request and hijack a valid CD hash for a.out, force AMFID to believe a.out is a legal program. Finally, our goal, running unauthorized binary, is achieved. To get the task port of AMFID, we can use API task for PID, but kernel states that only process assigned with the entitlement task for PID allow can call this API. In free sandbox code, we entitle self in the following way. Find out a process which has the entitlement we need, and then steal its ucred and assign the cred to self process. Then our process has the same entitlements, and we are able to call task for PID on AMFID now. But in iOS 14, there is a different situation. Almost everything is protected by tag. We can't steal ucred from other process, and we can't steal CR label or anything else. I had no choice but to look at the low-level data structure. Finally, I found that entitlements are stored in OS dictionary. I'm lucky that the dict entries is not packed. So I had a chance to replace the key value pairs in the dictionary, and the essential entitlements to make kernel believe that I'm a good process. But this time, I don't want to steal or borrow entitlements from others. Using setValue interface, we can attach properties to an I/O surface. They are stored in a dictionary associated with the surface. As we know, process entitlements are stored in a dictionary too, so we can put all the entitlements we need into the I/O surface values in advance. That is, we build an entitlements library for ourselves. When I need a new entitlement, I just take it directly from here. I'm not sure if anyone has used this method before. Maybe this way is a small innovation. So I didn't actually defeat data pack. In fact, I just found a way to avoid it. Moreover, I'd like to mention one more thing. I/O surface is really a treasure. It has already helped us to implement heap spree, fake object, building kernel read-write, and now it helps us again with the entitlement hack. I/O surface is really a powerful helper for exploit development. Okay, we successfully got the task port of AMFID. Next, let's do the real AMFID bypass. There are three weapons we can use: task set exception port, VM-write, and thread set state. We can bypass AMFID with the following steps. Note that MIS validate signature and copy info is the executable file validation procedure. We redirect it to invalid address. If a AMFI request comes, that function will throw an exception. We catch the exception, hijack the validation process, calculate the right CD hash for the executable file, put the result to AMFID memory to satisfy AMFI check. The last step, use the thread set state to set the PC register on the original return address. Furthermore, we are talking pack device, so we need to sign the address first. Finally, resume AMFID. This AMFID bypass strategy works fine on iOS 13, but fails on iOS 14. Well, this is sad. Let's look into it. With the crash log, we can confirm that AMFID stops at a weird address. So the problem is here. Setting PC register doesn't work as expected. Let's check the kernel code to see what thread set state does. I found that thread state is signed in user space, but in kernel it is stored in raw format. So thread set state will use target thread IAK to decode the PC register we specified. From the code, we know that JOP-PID is the so-called pack IAK. Then I read AMFID's JOP-PID back to user space and compared it with our own JOP-PID. They are different. Remember that we said iOS 14 introduces user space pack hardening. One process cannot forge function pointers in other process. This is the principle of it. Different process assigns different JOP-PID. So sign and auth a packed pointer with different IAK. That's why thread set state fails. AMFID got an invalid PC register. To make it works on iOS 14, we must assign the PC register with AMFID's IAK. But how? There is another function, thread get state. Contrary to set state, it reads thread state from kernel stack. Before returning the state to user space, thread get state will sign PC register with target thread's JOP-PID. So there are two functions about thread state, one for auth, one for sign. They make up a functional loop. Of course, we can both auth and sign PC register of our own thread, but AMFID bypass needs a return address correctly signed by AMFID's IAK. Now that we found a register signing method, if we can steal AMFID's IAK, overwrite our thread's IAK with it, we may achieve this goal. I create a dummy thread and suspend it, so I can manipulate freely. Target PC is the address that we want AMFID running to. We strip it to a raw pointer, sign it with IAK, and then set it to the dummy thread. This is our own thread, so there is no problem with this operation. Next, I copy the JOP-PID from AMFID's thread to our thread. Now we call thread get state. The PC will be signed with the new JOP-PID. Finally, we get a correctly signed PC register, and we can set this value to AMFID this time. Then AMFID will return a successful validation result as we want. The AMFID bypass is done. When I was studying thread state, I found a mega-core by accident. Thread convert thread state. Its code is shown below. If we specify the parameter direction to from self, it will help us convert our own thread state to target thread user representation. This is exactly what we want. This is the second way that can be used to bypass user space path hardening. And what's more, in this way, no kernel read-write required if you can get target's thread port. It's a perfect bypass. The code is simple. Just assign target PC with our own IAK, then convert it to AMFID's signed PC by the thread state converting API. About this API, I think it is useless except one scenario. When you intend to debug a process that doesn't belong to you, but it is really helpful to bypass user space path hardening. I guess maybe Apple will delete it someday for security. Now we have two ways to sign a pointer with other process IAK. It's time to complete the AMFID bypass. Let's repair the last step. Put the correctly signed return address into AMFID. As we expected, AMFID bypass on iOS 14 is working. We are able to execute an unauthorized binary. Okay, let me summarize all that I have talked today with this image. It gives an overview of how to execute unauthorized code in iOS 14 by exploiting a race condition bug. The red part is the outstanding exploit written by modern pwned. The green part is my iOS 14 learning journey. Maybe the stable kernel read-write primitive built by IO Surface Hack is the most helpful one. You can find the full exploit code in my GitHub. The link is given in the bottom. Actually, the code is the better way to express my thought. Last, I think iOS 14 is the most secure iOS ever. Everything has changed. Among the new mitigations, heap isolation and data pack are the outstanding ones. One kills most vulnerabilities, one kills most exploit primitives. With high-quality bugs like CVE 2021-1782, we are still able to pwn iOS kernel. Jailbreak is unstoppable, but it is indeed harder and harder than before. I learned everything from the community. Secuta Versa gives me the opportunity to contribute to iOS hack community. So I make a TQ pre-jailbreak fully open source now. Hope this will give some inspiration to researchers. Okay, thank you for watching. That's all of my talk today. I hope you enjoyed it. You can find the source code on my GitHub. And if you have questions, you can contact me by this email. Thank you.